Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
And I'm James Poulos, a producer at HuffPost Live.
And let's start off, James, by talking about Chuck Hagel, Obama's new nominee for Secretary of State, or I'm sorry, of Secretary of Defense. And it's been pretty divisive on the right, especially, actually. Hagel is a former Republican senator, but from the much reviled moderate wing of the party, and doesn't have much of a constituency for his views within, I guess, Republican legislators currently in Congress. I think that's fair to say. So what are your thoughts about whether he'd be a good Secretary of Defense, and what is this battle really about?
Well, I think Hagel is likely to go through. There's opposition on the left, there's opposition on the right. He's made some statements over the years that have raised some red flags for people. I won't rehearse the whole thing, it's pretty much out there. But what I think is most important about Hagel's nomination is that here's a guy who lacks any real champion or any real, even a cheerleader, certainly in Congress and elsewhere as well. There have been a few liberals out there, people like John Judas, Connie Bruck, and some others who think that Hagel would be a great Secretary of Defense. And there's definitely that wing of the Democratic Party that is that views people like Hagel favorably. Of course, his remarks on Iraq, he supported it, the war in Iraq to begin with, and then he thought that the surge was the greatest geopolitical blunder in history, which seems weird to me, but that's what he said. Nevertheless, I think much like Barack Obama himself, Hagel has this kind of arm's-length relationship with Congress. He doesn't have a hard core of support, and because that support is absent, because no one's really stepping forward in Congress and saying this guy's great and we want him and we love him, and it falls to Colin Powell and others to get on the Sunday shows and say Chuck Hagel is a good man and so on and so forth. Because of that, it's opened up space for the critics on the left and the right, but particularly the right, to register complaints, which might not make that much of a difference in the final analysis if a guy in Hagel's position had that real core of support. But because it's lacking, the critics are getting all the airtime. So probably people are going to roll over on this. AIPAC, as Eli Lake has reported, is pretty much going to let this one go by the boards. But it is revealing.
So let's dig into that a little bit. Let's dig into that a little bit more because you say AIPAC might let this one go by. One of the controversies over Hagel is whether he is sufficiently friendly to Israel. Bill Kristol has this emergency committee for Israel that's been running ads against Hagel. Brett Stevens in the Wall Street Journal suggested that some of his statements had, I think, the whiff of anti-Semitism is how he put it. And it seems like among a certain faction on the right, concern over Hagel's Israel positions, this is what is driving their opposition. Some would say that's what's driving their opposition. Others would say that they're stirring up the charge of anti-Semitism because what they're really afraid of is that Hagel's going to cut the military. Whether these opinion makers are being earnest or not, and I don't really have an opinion on it, do you think that Hagel's positions on Israel are of concern, or a good thing, or a bad thing? Is the Secretary of Defense going to make no difference in our relationship with a different country? How do you think about that part of the controversy?
Well, I'm not entirely sure how much of a practical difference it's going to make. Obviously, if you are a partisan in Israel's corner, as we typically understand that to work, you're going to wish that it was not Hagel and that it was someone else. He has made a few comments which do, I think, have a whiff of, if not outright anti-Semitism, then, the sort of remarks that a rather arrogant American foreign policy thinker who doesn't really have much time for the quote-unquote Israel lobby would say. And so, of course that's going to annoy some people. It does raise, I think, some of the broader questions about what kind of SecDef Obama wants. Someone who's going to be able to shepherd the Pentagon through a period of spending cuts, of restricted missions, of sort of caution and reticence when it comes to taking on new things. there's talk that Hagel's the sort of guy that a president would pick if the president wants to go soft on Iran and not pursue a military option. But we've known from the beginning that Obama doesn't want to pursue a military option with Iran. Of course, it's on the table, but that's just what you say when you're president, is you keep things on the table. That's part of negotiations. So although there's got to be some concern if you're concerned about military budgets and the use of American military force. There's going to be some concern that Hagel is going to work against your agenda. Sure. On the other hand, you've got Rand Paul out there saying things like, hey, if you're really a friend of Israel, maybe you should consider making sure that Israel isn't kind of this ward of the state of America's, where you've got to just keep the money flowing into Israel and Israel becomes dependent upon it. So there are at least a few Republicans out there who are making, if not identical remarks to Hagel's when it comes to Israel and military spending, then at least things that are kind of in the ballpark. Obama's going to set the tone for the way the U.S. military is used in his second term, and I think based on the track record of what we've seen in the first term, it's not a slam dunk that this is going to be a period of great quietude for the U.S. military. Obviously, Obama would like to worry about this stuff less. I think it's clear that he wants to spend as much time as he can on domestic stuff. But as we saw with Libya and as we saw with drone strikes, he's operating on a level where it just doesn't make sense, I think, to cast things in terms of active U.S. military versus passive U.S. military.
Great. James, I got most of that. You're breaking up a little bit on me, so if you can move your phone to a slightly better reception place, that would be great. But I did hear most of what you said. And I think that, to me, this is the big proxy fight that's going on right now of, what's the military budget going to be going forward in the next few years? How active a military footprint is the United States going to have in the world? And it's kind of disheartening to me that Obama is apparently representing the leftmost acceptable public position on this issue, because it seems to me that he wants to have a pretty active position in the world. I was reading this commentary, Symposium on Conservatism, and in John Bolton's article, he referred to Obama as a neo-isolationist. And I couldn't help but laugh at having someone described as a neo-isolationist that's waging, some form of actual military strikes in, at least 5 countries, and probably more than 5 countries that we don't know about. So I don't know. Bill Kristol said in one of his articles that a lot of the reason for support for Hagel, that he made the point that you did, that Hagel doesn't have very many champions, and he said that some of his champions are just spiteful and want to spite neoconservatives. And I think that there's a certain element of truth to that. Actually, I think that I don't think that the motivation actually is to spite neoconservatives. I don't think that people like me are inclined to feel a little bit more favorably toward Hagel because I want, Bill Kristol to walk around gnashing his teeth when he gets confirmed. I would just say that the fact that neoconservatives have come out against him so virulently is just sort of a heuristic for me that, well, I really disagree with them on foreign policy, and if they really don't want this guy, then maybe there is actually something good about it.
Well, right. I guess I'd say a couple things. First of all, in fairness to you, I don't think you're representative of the sort of guys who have been, inside the Beltway for, 20, 25 years. This is all very personal for them. It's inevitable that personal stuff and policy stuff and political stuff all gets thrown into the same bucket when you've been in the corridors of power, so to speak, for so long. I think that there is a personal element for them, and as it can seem a little bit petty when you're outside the Beltway, but inside this is the way the sausage gets made. The second point I'd make is that neocons are no strangers to to controversy, of course, but they also invite criticism. This is, I think, a sort of a badge of honor for them. They haven't been afraid, even going back to the 90s when neoconservatism first started getting some traction in foreign policy circles. So in a way, they've invited this kind of adversarial relationship with their policy opponents. And, now is a moment where they get to kind of reap that. And so I'm not surprised that on the one hand, they're venting their frustrations in a very pointed way. And, I think in part they've got to kind of enjoy it because they're fighting what they take to be the true fight. As far as Bolton's remarks go on Obama as neo-isolationist, obviously, at first blush, that seems a little weird, considering how active, whether it's with drones or special ops teams around the world, America is currently being, and that just bears Obama's stamp. This is now the hallmark of his foreign policy, even beyond sort of the intervention in Libya. But Bolton does have a point, which is the way Obama uses drones, the way that he uses the U.S. military in sort of a tactical way, is interventionist, clearly, in a superficial manner. But on a deeper level, I think there is a case to be made that Obama is very deliberately doing this so that he doesn't have to do other stuff, so that he can kind of unplug from other obligations and commitments, take a step back, and reposition America so that it does have more of a hands-off relationship with the rest of the world. If you think that that's like a big strategic blunder, then how are you going to talk about that? In the media, in front of the American people, you're going to cast it in terms of isolationism. That's the word that's out there. If you want to come up with a better one, please do. I'm on board for that project. But that opens up a much more complicated and nuanced conversation. And when you're trying to, frankly, torpedo someone's nomination to be Secretary of Defense, you gotta pick up the nearest blunt instrument and start swinging.
Yeah, I wonder if the instrument of isolationism, I wonder if that charge has the same resonance that maybe it once did in American politics. It seems to me that a lot more Americans now than during, say, 2002, 2003, 2004, think, if isolationism just means not invading other countries, maybe that's a good thing. And I understand your point that this word is being used in a pretty crude way because that's how you get resonance. If you're someone like John Bolton, then you know that your word is going to appear in a headline or going to appear in a soundbite. I just think that the more you use isolationism that crudely, the more the word itself loses its actual meaning and starts to become a proxy for I oppose lots of new wars.
Well, yeah, I think that's largely right. And there is another term out there, and it's anti-Americanism. This is if you think that isolationism is too soft of a charge, and this is something that Obama's had to deal with from the get-go, is, hey, you're pursuing an anti-American and un-American foreign policy. And, that's also a crude way of putting things. But, there is a deeper conversation sort of packed into that epithet, which is, to what extent is Obama really charting a course that is a radical departure from the way that, Clinton and Bush and going back before that, other presidents pursued American foreign policy? What were their basic assumptions about what American grand strategy looked like, what it was for, how it would work? And there is, I think there's a fair amount of evidence that suggests that if Obama has his druthers for another 4 years, what we're going to wind up with is a foreign policy and an American grand strategy that does, in some important respects, depart dramatically from business as usual, at least over the past generation or so. You might think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but there it is.
Well, I'm curious to hear more about that because my sort of view from 5,000 feet of what Obama is likely to do over the next 4 years is to draw down troops in Afghanistan, but probably not pull out completely by 2014, as he said that he would. And in the rest of the Middle East, I expect that he's going to keep muddling through. In other words, he's going to maintain he believes that America must have a large intelligence and military presence in the Middle East, and that it must meddle to some degree in affairs in that part of the world. And he is not of the opinion of someone like Rand Paul, who would prefer that we just leave that part of the world alone unless they're directly attacking us, in which case we respond, right? So, how is his foreign policy so different from George H.W. Bush's foreign policy, say?
Well, right, and some of this is a moving target. Egypt is a good example. So, the Obama administration should have known, I think, a little bit better than it did, how Egypt was likely to shake out, what the risks were. And, here we have an administration that is comfortable sort of sitting down with Morsi and saying, okay, it's a Muslim Brotherhood government. How can we make this work? That all by itself is alarming to a fair number of policymakers, a fair number of Americans. Obama's attitude toward, toward Israel is, half of the story. The other half is his attitude toward Palestine and toward sort of Islamist government in general. Part of the reason why the thing with Iran is such a big deal is this isn't just, garden variety foreign government that wants weapons that they don't currently have. This is a government with a very particular kind of regime, and the nature of that regime raises the hackles of people who are concerned still about the threat posed by radical Islam to America's sort of position in the world. So, I think when you're looking at the way Obama's charting his foreign policy, you've got to look at who he's willing to sit down with, who he's willing to find a sort of modus vivendi with. It's the same thing that we get when Obama presses the reset button with Russia and treats Russia with greater forbearance than sort of traditional interventionists, traditional hawks would want him to. So it's not just drones. It's not just sending teams into far-flung parts of the world. There's a broader picture there. It's also in Europe where Obama's very reluctant to get into the thick of it with a missile shield. From the perspective of many of his critics, this is treating our allies in a way that we're not accustomed to treating them, that perhaps our allies aren't accustomed to being treated. And so again, there are a couple different ways we could talk about that. One sensational way that will grab people's attention is to cast it in terms of an un-American foreign policy.
Yeah, I guess you certainly fingered the relevant controversies, and my part of my response is just that this idea that it's un-American or objectionable even to talk to or try to engage with certain governments, it seems to me a relatively new one. Not to say that it's never come up in history before, but if we look back to American foreign policy in World War II and afterwards, we certainly see Reagan sitting down and negotiating with the head of the Soviet Union, and we see you talk about Obama and whether he's going to put a missile shield in parts of Europe. We've gotten to a point where whether you want the easternmost countries in Europe to be a part of NATO or whether you want a missile shield is somehow this litmus test for how you feel about those countries, when you don't have to go back so far to a time when the United States was tolerating them literally being subjugated by the Soviet Union. It seems like the goalposts on both of these things have moved such a long way, and this is why I object. One of the reasons I object to the un-American charge. It just seems ahistorical to me to cast these things as a fundamental departure from what we've done in the past. In fact, they seem to be very much like things we've done in the past. The past of our foreign policy has many strains in it, but certainly talking to people who we are very wary of and not having all of Europe under our literal security umbrella like a missile shield, these things aren't new, right?
In some ways, they're not new. And, you're not going to catch me calling Obama's foreign policy un-American. In some ways, it's almost, it's all too American in some respects. However, there are certain differences. I think it was easier for Republicans to accept what Reagan did during the Cold War when it came to negotiation. And even then, there were people who said, hey, you can't just sit down with these people. You call them an evil empire, and that's what they are, and this is weird. The consolation, to put it a little ironically, is like, well, if we have to negotiate with them, at least we're fighting a Cold War against them, and we want to win, and that's sort of our attitude going into the negotiation. I think one of the things that bothers people about Obama's foreign policy, and this is a place where I think we need more discussion, is it's not entirely clear. Obama hasn't made a clear and concise case about what the goal is in terms of, like, say, relations with Russia. During the Cold War, Reagan could say, okay, so the goal is we win, they lose, and that kind of that sets the table. It sets the table for negotiations. And it sets the table for sort of explaining to America, explaining to policymakers what the president ultimately wants. It's not evident what Obama ultimately wants in terms of our relationship with Russia. This is an administration that, in terms of foreign policy, has been pretty good at handling urgent things. There are, a number of catastrophes we could think up that the administration hasn't gotten us into. And, I'm of the mind that you definitely don't want to make an enemy of Russia. Things would become very, very difficult for us to do, even without substantial cuts to the Pentagon budget. If we took actions and made statements that would cause Russia to say, okay, fine, we're your enemy now. Okay, that's how we're going to play this. We don't want that. Nevertheless, I do think that, if Obama does want to go down the road he's going down with Russia, he's got to do a better job of explaining what the end game is. Where is this leading us? And if the answer is like, well, it's leading us to not having the problems we had when Bush was president, that's maybe going to get you through half of your first term. It's not going to hack it for your second term.
Why don't we skip ahead and shift to domestic matters a little bit? As I mentioned before, Commentary just had this big symposium on the future of conservatism, and I see the National Review has one scheduled for later in January at the Omni Hotel in Washington, D.C. And maybe another way to get into this subject, I was just watching an episode of Uncommon Knowledge with Peter Robinson interviewing John Yoo and Rob Long. And John Yoo was pretty sanguine about Mitt Romney's loss. He basically felt like Mitt Romney was a bad candidate and the loss wasn't that huge. It was, a few percentage points in the other direction. Things would have been different. And his basic argument was that conservatism is sound and we just need a better vehicle for these beliefs. And Rob Long and Peter Robinson both took exception to this. And I want to read you what Rob Long said. Basically, what John Yoo said is that the military talks about tactics and strategy. And he said that conservatism's tactics are flawed, perhaps, but its strategy is sound. And Rob Long responded, to use the military analogy, if you set out a strategy over the last 40 years, you say, okay, we lost the battle of socialized medicine. We lost the battle of big government. We lost the battle on deficits. We lost the battle on taxes. We lost the battle on social issues. I'm sorry, what are the battles that are left? And Peter Robinson picked things up and said, take Obamacare alone. One point that Rob is making here is that this isn't reversible. This is irreversible. The country is suddenly ratcheted to the left, and whether or not Barack Obama had a mandate to do it, he did it. And as Obamacare begins to be enacted over the next 4 years, which it will begin to shape and mold the American character and American expectations. So I guess my question for you to kick off this topic is, are Rob Long and Peter Robinson being too pessimistic, or are things really that bad for conservatism, a series of catastrophic losses, catastrophic battles, if you want to use that analogy? Where do you come down on it?
Okay, so, I know Peter, I know Rob. I worked with them, for them at Ricochet.com several years ago. So, I appreciate their point of view, and I think that conservatism can mean a lot of different things, and it's, I think, still quite resilient. This is a basket of ideas and principles and commitments and convictions that isn't going to just sort of die off. Maybe demographics will shift that around a little bit, but these are enduring ideas. They're not going to go away. Republicanism, on the other hand, this is a big question mark right now, for the reasons that you described, and just you run down the list of the defeats, and it's a pretty comprehensive list. And it raises some questions about, what's the Republican Party all about? What does it stand for? What does it mean? How much does it need to mean something? Should a political party, really even be or have an ism? I think those are all sort of fair questions and ones that Republicans need to confront. And some of them have tried to do this with mixed results. So, David Frum, what's motivating David Frum? Well, I think what's motivating him is exactly what you described, which is, here's a long list of failures of Republicans to implement their policy preferences. It's just not working very well. So accept that and pay attention to what realities in the actual world we're living in have contributed to those losses, and then try to chart a way forward. That might not be very sexy or very gratifying, and it's sure to annoy Republicans who don't want to have to think that way. And I think to look at a guy like Frum, who I'm also friendly with David, and I think he's a very powerful mind, but much like a Chuck Hagel or a Barack Obama, he thinks quite well of his ability to think problems through, and he's quite willing to take a more adversarial attitude toward people on the right who are saying, no, we don't need to change the game plan. Mitt Romney was just not the greatest candidate, and we'll get him next time. And so I think it's going to take a while before conservatives who have not sort of been released from the movement, so to speak, are able to take that kind of serious look at the balance sheet and say, how do we reboot this? It's going to take a while before Republicans, conservatives who have that kind of cred can make those kinds of claims without sort of spoiling the party.
Right. One thought that I have, one thing that I would suggest both conservatives and Republicans have to deal with is, obviously entitlements and how much we spend on them are going to be a pretty huge part of the political conversation in the United States over the next several years, probably in coming decades. And there's been a lot of talk about Obamacare. There's been some talk about Medicare and Social Security. And it seems to me that Republicans like to talk about these issues as if there is a fundamental divide between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, as if the Democratic Party stands for European socialism and the Republican Party stands for free market capitalism, and there's just this intractable difference in principle, this intractable thing, and it's a sort of zero-sum fight. I don't think that Republicans or conservatives, and there are some exceptions when you talk about conservatives, but I don't think for the most part people really believe this. And I'm not saying that they're being disingenuous. I'm just saying that I don't think that their thinking is clear on this in this way. It seems to me that every time Republicans wield power, and even every time someone like a ticket like Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan try to wield power, they talk about the welfare state. They talk about the social safety net in terms of making tweaks to it so that it's sustainable over the long term. And I don't want to minimize the differences between the two parties, because I happen to think that liberals are supporting a welfare state that's unsustainable in its current form, and that these serious reforms are needed to make it sustainable. But when Republicans talk about it, there's this disconnect between their rhetoric and the policies that they actually put forward. And it seems to me like their rhetoric is, we want to get rid of the welfare state. We're against redistribution. We're against entitlements, right? But then, in fact, the reality of their policy is we want to tweak these things and make them more affordable and perhaps run them a little bit better, at least by our lights. And there's something in that disconnect that is almost like the worst of both worlds. It's like you're turning off voters, a lot of voters who actually rely on a social safety net or think that there should be something, without even the benefit of like actually wanting to get rid of it when you come into power.
Yeah, this is a painful position to be in. On the one hand, Republicans don't want to be the party that says, torch the welfare state. On the other hand, they don't want to be the party that says, like, oh, what are we all about? Well, we're about doing what the other guys want to do, but doing it, like, a lot more slowly and with more circumspection and more responsibly, and our wonks are better than your wonks, and, this is, you go down that road, and what do you get? You get the blueprint for Obamacare, is what you get.
Sure.
And you see how well that worked out. So, and it's sad because you do have Republicans out there, powerful ones, who really influence policy, who want to save these programs. They want to make them fiscally sound. They want to minimize their impact on the budget. Insofar as, the budget is now basically spiraled completely out of control. And some people are okay with that. But if you're not okay with that, what do you want to do? Well, you want to make sure that your entitlement programs, which you aren't going to get rid of, will be viable. But people don't believe that. They don't believe that Republicans want to save Medicare. They don't believe that Republicans want to save Social Security. This is a big problem because Republicans now have to choose between either saying, like, yes, we do, and here's how we're going to prove that through our actions, or actually, no, we don't, and basically we're just fighting this endless rearguard action.
And I think that this very phenomenon that we're talking about helps explain this other phenomenon of the Republican rank and file being sort of constantly both loyal to and insanely disaffected with the Republican Party, and constantly having these sort of wrenching conversations about has this person gone to Washington and violated their principles? Have they compromised their principles, right? It seems like a little bit of that is inevitable when you have, one thing that actually, you mentioned David Trump, one thing that he has pointed out, and that I've also pointed out when it comes to Mark Levin, who both of us have argued with, is that Levin, if you read Liberty and Tyranny, his book, talks about Medicare and Social Security, talks about the New Deal as if it is tyranny incarnate, and as if the whole coalition that identifies with and supports the New Deal did something back then that was unconstitutional, that is still unconstitutional, that is unacceptable for a principled conservative to ever put up with it. And yet, you won't ever hear Mark Levin come out on his show and say we need to abolish Medicare in the same way that he is perfectly happy to come out and say we need to take an absolutist position on the Second Amendment, say, right? It's not absolutist positions that are politically unrealistic that he won't take. It's specifically getting rid of Medicare or getting rid of Social Security. And the reason for that, as anyone who follows right-leaning media probably knows, is that elderly conservatives, the people that watch Fox News and listen to talk radio in larger numbers than any other demographic, they like these programs. They want these programs to stick around. They feel, conservatives like my grandparents feel like not only have they paid their fair share of taxes for their whole life, not only have they paid more than their fair share of taxes their whole life, they paid their payroll taxes into these programs, and maybe they wouldn't have set them up back in the day, but at the same time, they deserve them. They deserve to receive them now. And it just seems like why, if you have this simultaneous inability to change something and an insistence on talking about first principles in a way that if anyone draws the logical connections would seem to mandate getting rid of them entirely, you're going to have this constant kind of grinding where it just seems like you're unprincipled all the time.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot going on here. At the level of theory, at the level of principle, the liberty versus tyranny frame, this is something we've talked about before. It would work better if it was liberty versus servitude. Those are really sort of the apples to apples. And it's just hard to make the case that that the government is setting us up for servitude, not because the government isn't growing as it's growing and becoming more and more involved in the intimate details of everyday life, which it is, hallmarks of servitude, right? But because so many people just don't think of their relationship with the government as being that kind of relationship. They don't see the government as an obstacle to their success. They see it as a guarantor of their security, of their safety, of the foundation of everyday life. And it's just hard to make the case to people that that this is a government that's oppressing them. On the other hand, there's a lot of generational stuff going on here. So there's no doubt that Republicans are in the box that they're in large part because of the sort of older voters that you mentioned and the kind of commitments that they expect government to keep. And this is, in a way, this is an awkward period that that Republicans maybe do have some hope of just kind of toughing out. When you look at what Glenn Beck is now doing relative to what Fox News is doing, Fox News is moving in the direction of being the TV channel for old Republicans. And what Glenn Beck is doing now is very deliberately making a move toward a more overtly libertarian sort of worldview and media view. And I think that's tremendously smart. Not just smart, as some of the cynics have suggested, because there's more money to be found there. It's like a fresher, richer vein to tap. But just because it corresponds better to reality. Corresponds better to the reality of the people who are going to be around longer than the people who are, in retirement, holding up signs at Tea Party rallies saying, "Government, you hands off my Medicare." The demographics are changing in America, as we all know. Usually Republicans fret about this. But I think there's maybe an upside here that Republicans aren't paying enough attention to, which is this kind of strain of practical libertarianism among younger people who aren't obsessed with Medicare. What they're worried about is, gosh, if government can mint as much money as it wants and spend as much money as it wants, and there's effectively no oversight, what inevitably happens is you get a government that spends billions and billions of dollars on things that really do put us in a position of servitude. Surveillance, drug war, criminal justice, that whole suite of government interventions in our everyday life. Those kinds of things really are potent examples of what a servile existence under a tyrannical government looks like. And so it doesn't surprise me that that who's on Piers Morgan getting all the clicks? Alex Jones, a guy who a lot of people think is a total crackpot. But more importantly than whether or not he's a crackpot is he a radical figure on the right? And the answer is yes. And that strain of thought is going to be more influential going forward, not less so.
Yeah, and I think that every once in a while I'll get an email from some of my readers who basically say, we agree with your critiques of conservatism, with your critiques of the Republican Party, so why don't you identify with the Democratic Party? And those issues, the civil liberties issues that you mentioned, are part of the answer. Another part of the answer, though, is California. You and I both live here, and it's wonderful in a whole lot of ways, but the Democratic Party has been running things in California for quite a while, and now actually it's over the 2/3 hump in the legislature so that it can basically push through its agenda without Republicans being able to do much of anything about it. And what we've seen in California is not a model of whatever you think of efficient technocratic governance. It's not that we have in California. What we have in California are special interest groups, and in California's case, because Democrats are running things, democratic special interest groups that are basically destroying government from the other direction, that the most radical conservatives would want to destroy government. In other words, there are all these municipalities and counties where you have firefighters and prison guards and teachers, and it isn't that they are merely making good salaries. It isn't that they're terrible people. In fact, most of them are good people who are just doing their jobs and who have negotiated the best deal for themselves that they could get, and you can't really blame them for that. But at some point, you can't afford to pay all of your retired firefighters 6 figures for the rest of their lives and have them retire at 50 years old and have this be a sustainable model. And you've seen cities like San Jose that have gone bankrupt and have had to fire most of their existing employees in order to pay the retirement benefits of their retired employees. You have all of these state boards where well-connected people are making 6-figure salaries for sitting around and doing not much of anything all year. The mayor of LA, Antonio Villaraigosa, was just on vacation and was photographed with Charlie Sheen at his new bar in Mexico, which has come to symbolize for some people a kind of decadence of the California ruling elite. You have all of these things coming together in really a present-day vision of what I think the best conservative critique of the Democratic Party and of the unsustainable fiscal path that they're putting us on. It's arrived in California, and for a lot of people in these cities that have actually gone bankrupt, the consequences have been pretty dire. Everyday services going away, calling the police because you've had something stolen from you and not having anyone be able to come and take a police report for days, if at all. So I would say that we're really between the fact that some of the Republican Party's critiques of the welfare state don't actually hold together when you dig down to first principles and then you look at their actions. The fact that there's a contradiction there does not mean that there's not a huge problem. And I know that you don't disagree with that, but I think that there is a sort of self-satisfied tone of liberals who are looking at conservative dysfunction. And I would just say there's plenty of examples of liberal dysfunction, of democratic dysfunction, if you just look to the West.
Oh, there's no question. And the self-satisfaction on the left here is just delusional, and it's frightening how deep into the bones it goes. What we have in California is a classic one-party state. Occasionally Republicans can muck up the works a little bit, but they have not managed to make an impact in a substantial way on democratic rule in California, and it's now been present with us, as you know, long enough that I think we can start making some serious considered judgments, some final judgments about the perils of one-party rule and the perils of the specific policy platform that the Democrats in California and elsewhere have tried to implement at the state and local level. It does not work when you have a guy like Rahm Emanuel out in Chicago who, finds himself in the awkward position of basically having to go to war with the unions to keep Chicago solvent. You've got a serious sort of conceptual hurdle to clear on the left,
Yes.
And I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. There's another crazy irony here, which is there's space right now for a Republican to say, hey, Democrats who rule these big states are destroying them, and unlike the federal government, which can print money forever, depending on how the international political economy is doing, state and local governments can't. When they go bankrupt, they go bankrupt. When they go bankrupt, they have to, sort of fire workers and abrogate contracts and stop policing the streets. And these are real-world consequences that the federal government just doesn't have to face, again, barring some kind of international financial meltdown.
Right.
Not impossible, but the federal government can pursue an economic policy where deficits basically don't matter. And state and local governments can't do that. And when state and local governments try to do what it is that Democrats want them to do and what Democratic constituents want them to do, the evidence shows that they get into this intractable situation where the only way out is basically bail out the states, bail out the municipalities. Of course, this is anathema to Republicans, and even Democrats don't want to go down that road. But if I was a crazy Republican, what I would say is, hey, we need to bail out state and local governments, and we need to do that because the Democratic Party has failed Americans.
Why don't we close today with guns? It's been much in the news since the Newton, Connecticut shooting and has stayed in the news after that massacre for longer than guns usually stay in the news after these sort of mass public shootings that get lots of media attention. I've written a few pieces about it. And one of the things that struck me after it was happening, I was following Twitter that day, and I remember your tweets in particular as kind of resonating with me. And you were reacting not as someone who had a certain policy reaction to this, but as someone who had a certain, I don't know how to say, human reaction to it, sociological reaction to it. Tell me about what you were thinking, and maybe you should characterize your tweets that day and what made you think about.
The first time that I was really moved by President Obama, I was sitting in the newsroom getting together the segments for the day with my fellow producers. And there on the big screen was the president giving his press conference right in the wake of the shootings. And as everyone saw, he was tearing up, clearly not faked emotion. And it was a truly moving moment, and I think that was probably true for many of us who watched that particular press conference. It's clear that something is going on in America which is deeply wrong, and it's difficult because the people who use their guns responsibly don't make headlines. Unless they shoot an intruder and then it bleeds, so it leads. The people who make the headlines are quote unquote the crazies.
Right.
And the challenge for us, I think, is one, to recognize just how blurry the line is between the sane people and the crazy people. And the deeper challenge is to acknowledge how badly we're gripped by fear, not just fear of someone busting into our movie theater and massacring us, but fear that if we lose one particular policy battle, then all is lost. Fear that that the other team is really in danger of ruining our lives. Fear that if we don't do something now in response to every crisis, that we are somehow failing ourselves, failing our children, failing our country. Radley Belko's spoken on this subject, where the upshot of crisis policymaking is, let's have a freak out, let's pass some sweeping bit of legislation or some sweeping suite of regulations, and they'll linger far after the crisis that we've responded to in such a gut-wrenching way is gone. Arguably something like Social Security was a response to a massive, horrible crisis in America, and that crisis, Great Depression, has long since gone, but Social Security lives on, for good or for ill. So it was very difficult in the immediate wake of Newton, and of course the other shootings, Aurora and the others, not to have that fear-driven reaction. And at a time when the influence of religion, not just on American politics, but on the fabric of American life, is waning, as we've been accustomed to, as we've known it. Death takes on a different character for us, I think. The capacity of Americans to accept untimely death as a part of everyday life is diminishing. And that's having an impact on the way we think about guns. It's having an impact on the way we think about policy. Just to go back to Alice Jones on Piers Morgan. Piers wanted to keep asking the question, why does someone need this weapon, this terrible weapon? Why do you need that weapon? And Alex missed the opportunity to say, look, if this is truly a question of liberty, it's not a question of need. Liberty isn't about what we need. Liberty is about what we want and what we have a right to do and to have. That's a difficult question. It's a difficult conversation to have in the wake of a grisly shooting. It's a difficult conversation to have even when there isn't a grisly shooting.
Right, yeah.
These are foundational questions about politics. And if we go into them from a standpoint of fear, whether it's fear of being shot by a crazy person, fear that the government is going to take over our lives, fear that if the Democrats have their way, then my way of life is going to be ruined, fear that if Republicans have their way, then my way of life is going to be ruined, we are going to place a burden on politics that is so powerful and so outside the scope and competence of politics that we're really going to be doing ourselves a disservice. We're going to be saddling ourselves with policies that that are going to be unable to satisfy us in the medium term, definitely in the long term.
When I was, I did a brief stint at the San Bernardino Sun newspaper, and while I was there, San Bernardino has had a lot of shootings over the years. It's a pretty crime-ridden area, but when I was there, there was this one particular shooting, and if I recall correctly, it was kind of a gang shooting gone wrong, and the victim ended up being like a 7 or 8 year old little girl who got caught with a bullet that wasn't meant for her while she was in her family's apartment and ended up dying. And I think her name was Mynisha. She was one of those crime victims that within the small world of San Bernardino news really resonated with people. In sort of the way that Newton resonates with Americans more than other shootings because of its numbers, that gun crime in San Bernardino resonated with people because of the youth of the victim and the fact that she was in her family's home when it happened, and that of course makes everyone feel insecure. Like if we can't even protect our kids when they're in our homes, then where are we? It taps into something pretty primal in people. And at the local level, when these things happen, there isn't so much of a policy-driven discussion because gun policy really isn't going to be made in any sort of effective way at the San Bernardino municipal level, of course. What did happen was kind of an outpouring of concern, I would say human concern, a kind of notion that we have to do something about this. Maybe we have to intervene with gangs. Maybe we have to just reach out and appeal to the humanity of young people and show them this can be the consequence if you go on a drive-by. There are a lot of impulses like that, and those two were certainly not the only ones. They were probably as varied as the number of people who were thinking we should do something and not quite knowing what that thing should be. But it occurred to me then, and it occurs to me now, that that maybe there was something important in that, and maybe all of those people kind of going out into the community with a new determination to head off violence, to address kids earlier so that fewer join gangs, to try to reach out to gang members and get them to not go on reckless drive-bys. I don't know which of those particular things would work and which of them would fail, and I'm sure a lot of them would fail and not do any good. But I can't help but thinking that all of those individual people going out and trying to take on a very small piece of the problem, some of them are going to succeed, and they're going to succeed in quiet ways that no one ever knows about. But this isn't what I'm saying isn't an argument to not pass any legislation in the aftermath of Newton or to pass any particular legislation. I'm just saying quite completely apart from the national policy debate. I think that there is use that gets lost in the media of individuals going out and changing their community in the most direct way, in the way that they talk to other people, in the way that they try to head off problems, in the case of Newton, in the way that they maybe keep an eye out for a kid that seems like he is very angry or is going to blow up. And when you try to think about how these things might be put into policy, no one wants authority figures running around and keeping an eye out for any kid who looks a little bit off and throwing him in jail or anything like that. There is no way to formalize these kinds of things in policy. It's just kind of being a little bit more attentive, maybe a little bit more kind to people, maybe a little bit more attuned to what's going on around you, and attuned to the idea that you are part of this community and there's no way to really escape that. And so making it better in small ways is going to pay dividends, and trusting that it will. That was kind of one of my reactions to Newton that I haven't written about, actually. But I definitely thought back to San Bernardino, and I think even now people in that community would say that the way that people kind of came together after the Nyesha shooting did make things better in the community in some way.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that kind of activity, and the question, which bears some superficial resemblance to a policy question, is like, well, how do we encourage this stuff? How do we institutionalize it? I'm tempted to say that we might be surprised by the way that sort of new agey, quasi-spiritual organizations could help here. Americans are still quite spiritual people, relatively speaking. And if there's one place where religion is seeing sort of growth, it's in this, heretical or non-dogmatic kind of realm, ranging all the way from things like Pentecostalism to, to some of the more sort of high-level kind of like, things that would get caricatured as self-help sort of organizations. All that kind of stuff. I've seen a bit of it in practice out here, this being California. And it really can make a difference. And it makes a difference because people who come out of these kinds of programs, people who I think take the best of what we could, caricature again as new agey kind of stuff to heart and actually live it and apply it to their everyday lives. They go into their relationships with strangers and friends and family from a standpoint of relative fearlessness. Fearlessness about sort of their own identity, abandoning a lot of the hang-ups that I think plague lots of people, their class or economic position notwithstanding. And so it seems, a bit of a leap, especially for traditional conservatives, to say, hey, it's actually going to be really good for the culture if people think of themselves less as being autonomous individuals and think of themselves more as like, as these beings who can create possibilities in the world by announcing them and then living into them with some kind of integrity. And if you think of yourself not as an autonomous individual who's sort of trapped in this body, but as a space where certain kinds of relationships can develop, I think that can be tremendously powerful in breaking through some of our really intense fear barriers and creating a mechanism for us to have those conversations, to find ourselves in unscripted face-to-face encounters with strangers, and to come out of it not with something transactional, but with something even transformative.
Yeah, I think that the way that I would, maybe a way to put it that would be a little bit easier sell for your traditional conservative, and a way of putting it that I actually agree with on its own terms, is that, we all agree that there are some things that are worth institutionalizing, that it's important to institutionalize. We should also all agree that there are important things that are beyond institutions, and that individuals, if they're fulfilling whatever obligation that they have to their families, and beyond their families, to their communities, they shouldn't ever be compelled to fulfill those obligations to government. They aren't properly obligations conferred by or enforced by the state. But being a part of a community is nevertheless important. It's one of those beyond the state things that Republicans and conservatives are supposed to not want to go away if the state becomes too big. That's one of the reasons they fear the state becoming too big, because it will displace these other important things. And I guess I would just say that it's easy when you're consuming, when all of the media you consume is focused on national politics, on national discourse, on national culture, to forget that sometimes the most important thing that you can do is in day-to-day, face-to-face encounters, or making small changes in your own community, and that a bunch of people doing that is going to pay bigger dividends in many cases than doing one big thing at the national level that's supposed to filter down to everyone.
I agree, and and I'd also add that it's important to think in terms of making big changes in your community too. That it doesn't take a genius or a hero or someone with political power to make a dramatic impact over a goodly number of people over their lives and their communities over just a period of even 5 to 10 years. I've seen neighborhoods in Los Angeles that have been transformed because a relative handful of people decided that they were really going to get in the game, whether it's with rehabbing houses or launching certain businesses or just getting involved in the fabric of reality on that right down at ground level, on that kind of basis. It really can work. And if you've got your eye on what's going to happen with the budget, what's going to happen with unemployment insurance, yes, these things are significant, but if you think that they define the whole, then you're going to be frustrated.
Right. Well, we should probably stop there. We're at an hour, but it's been enjoyable as always, and I hope we do it again soon.
Thanks very much.